Welcome to this session, to this expert lecture, as it is officially called, on moving towards transformative resilience, building evaluation knowledge for effective climate change adaptation. My name is Dennis Boers. I'm the team leader of Sea Change Community of Practice. I'll tell a little bit more about it in a second. To my far right is Lucy Faulkner, ICCCAD International Center for Climate Change and Development consultant. And next to me is Ravesloot of TANGO International, who will be our discussant. And the title here in itself says that we are moving, so we're not there yet. It's a move towards transformative resilience. And next to that, during this presentation, we will also discuss whether or not we are expecting to arrive at transformative resilience or not. That's a whole different discussion, and we will go a little bit into that one. Next to that, it says building evaluation knowledge for effective climate change adaptation. And there we have another topic, adaptation. How does that relate to resilience? And we will touch upon that as well in a moment from now. Lucy will present for 10 to 15 minutes on the ARCAB ICCCAD M&E framework. And after that, Bruce will take 4 or 5 minutes to point towards a number of principles regarding M&E and resilience. And after that, we hope to get a lively discussion going, because we don't want to just sit here and present towards you, especially because this room is so small. It's easy to have a bit of a discussion. And I'm really happy to see that so many people managed to find this room. That's wonderful. I want to ask, how many people here work for INGOs? Or NGOs? Okay. And how many people are in the academia? And how many in the private sector? And government? Multilateral and donors? Look at that. We have a very nice melange of people here. How many people really work in resilience programming? And how many people really work on resilience monitoring and evaluation? Look at that. Okay, that's a nice crowd that we have here for this discussion. Anyone want to give a specific sector in which they work? Livelihoods?
Urban.
Urban? Rural, anyone? A mix or mainly urban focus?
Rural and coastal.
Okay, that's nice. We really have a nice mix here.
Agriculture, food security.
Good. Nice. Thank you. A little bit of background how this panel came into existence. We are all members of Sea Change, which is a community of practice on monitoring and evaluation of climate change interventions. And we are very open about the definition of interventions, which can be policy, which can be programs, which can be mitigation, adaptation, resilience. And the focus is on Asia, although we do welcome people who are not from Asia or do not focus on Asia. So characters are welcome. If you want to be part of the Sea Change community of practice, feel free to approach me, and I'll give you an introduction to the community of practice. It's an online platform, but apart from that we do a lot of things offline with respect to publicizing work, presentations like this one. And online we do webinars, discussions, and have our newsletter and the standard things you would expect from a community of practice. And we would like to thank Rockefeller Foundation, being the founder and the funder both of this community of practice, and PACT Institute as a Washington-based INGO, who is the implementing partner of this community of practice. And having said that, I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
So good afternoon everyone, my name is Lucy, and as Dennis said, I've been doing some ongoing work with the International Center for Climate Change and Development, which is based in Dhaka in Bangladesh. One long-term action research program run by the centre is called ARCAB, that I've been working on, and this is really focusing on community-based adaptation. So ARCAB is a collaborative platform that is bringing together 12 international INGOs working on community-based adaptation in Bangladesh, such as CARE, ActionAid, Oxfam and others. And we've really come together to answer key knowledge needs that we all have, but as yet we have no answers to. So everyone really wanted to know is what is effective community-based adaptation to begin with, what do we need to measure for it, and how do we measure it? So the long-term goal of ARCAB is to really generate longitudinal evidence on community-based adaptation effectiveness, which obviously has implications for attracting adaptation finance and other aspects. So we all know that we wanted to build climate resilience, but we weren't really sure to begin with what this looks like or what it means. So working together, these organisations decided that what climate resilience means for them is seeing the climate vulnerable poor groups that they work with on the ground, that they'll be able to undertake long-term sustainable adaptation strategies to potential future climate change impacts. And this was really kind of learning lesson number one. A lot of NGOs that we work with are adapting to climate variability, thinking they might be adapting to climate change, but actually they're not. And so what does this mean? What is the difference between climate variability, climate change, and what does that mean for our practice on the ground? So as a starting point, we developed a very broad-based theory of change, which really helped us identify 4 different resilience pathways where we want to get to. But this theory of change also helped us identify the number of different stakeholders and information needs people have in the community-based adaptation landscape. So obviously we have the communities themselves, but we also have other people that are involved, such as the INGOs, donors, and also the community of practice that we're trying to influence. So this first slide really shows that we've taken a multi-track monitoring and evaluation strategy for community-based adaptation. It's not just a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work. We need to be looking at how to monitor and evaluate across scales. So this starts at the bottom track, you can see with PM&E at community level. Then we're looking at working with INGOs, and this is one area that I'm going to really focus on today, looking at are we doing community-based adaptation effectively? Another element that I'm going to bring out today is looking at the monitoring evaluation of INGO capacity to answer where are we now for supporting effective CBA. This is very good in theory, but there's these 2 elements I brought out in particular because these are the elements that we've operationalised the most to date so far. So, towards our goal of long-term climate resilience, what do we need to be measuring? We're saying there's one track that we need to be looking at, and this is looking at building adaptive capacity at community level. Now, adaptive capacity means different things to different people, depending on your background, which institution you work with. But what was decided within all these INGOs, that adaptive capacity for us is formed of 2 elements. The first element we're looking at is based on the wide agreement that good development is the starting point for adaptation. So we're going to be looking at measuring increases in values of assets in light of climate and other risks, increases in well-being. We're also going to be looking at evidence of improved skills and resources to undertake new and improved practices, and also changes in perception of being able to manage certain climate risks that people face. But the other element that we looked at for adaptive capacity also relates to access to and use and availability of certain climate and non-climate information. So what we also looked at what this means for climate information is bringing community understandings and historical perceptions of vulnerability and past environmental issues and bringing them together with more scientific information to form a new kind of information that's kind of more credible and useful for identifying adaptation strategies on the ground. Under this track of adaptive capacity, when we had our theory of change, one of the pathways is looking at scaling resilience out. So once we know what's effective, looking at how to reach more people. So other indicators what we're looking at under here is evidence of learning and evidence of sharing practice that's happening organically between communities beyond project boundaries. So that's one track. We're also saying to measure effective CBA, we also need to be looking more upstream to looking at what institutions are doing, because as we know, adaptation doesn't happen in a vacuum, but in an institutionally rich context. So we need to be looking at measuring capacity of institutions to manage climate risks and deliver adaptation benefits to people that we work with on the ground. So we're looking at indicators for this around level of knowledge of climate change and climate variability, levels of using this knowledge in actual planning. Also looking at knowledge needs of climate vulnerable poor groups themselves, looking at inclusiveness indicators, so percentages, for example, of climate vulnerable poor participating in local planning and budgeting meetings, and then evidence of annual budget allocated to climate vulnerable poor adaptation activities. We've also done some work recently with the CRA, and we're looking at other capacity indicators here, which were quite interesting, looking at the ability to trade off possible futures given different uncertainty factors, and also ability to discuss, generate and adapt maybe existing capacities and practices, adapt them in terms of changing circumstances as is required. So as we're looking at, so if we build adaptive capacity at community level and we're building a stronger institutional mechanism, what we're saying we should have in the middle is hopefully evidence that people and institutions are adapting and being innovative in response to risk. So this is really looking at evidence of shifts from maybe coping mechanisms towards more adaptation, and maybe looking at what does this mean in practice, what are the differences. And the thing that makes this different here is that we need to be measuring all of this in light of climate and other risks. So really tracking all of these, tracking what the relevant climate and other risks are at community level, and making sure that all indicators reflect this. So what does this really mean in practice? One qualitative approach we've been looking at is really bringing the idea of a theory of change down to community level. Because obviously the indicators that are chosen have to relate to the project itself. As I said, ARCAB is a project that is working with 12 INGOs. All different INGOs have different projects in different adaptation contexts, and all working on different themes of adaptation, some which are specific to adaptation itself, others which are more development focused. So we decided that in order to understand what indicators we want, the indicators aren't just to be developed by INGOs themselves, but also very much to be community-led. We thought we'd try bringing, as I said, this theory of change approach down to community level to help communities really have a real strong influence in the planning and what the projects are going to be. We found this approach to be particularly useful. We've done it with local government as well as community members involved in different projects. And I think the message here is that theory of change isn't just necessarily useful for us to help understand complexity and to make causal links between what we do, but it's the same at community level. A lot of communities come around, and local government said to us, we have a lot of NGOs that come to us all doing their own kind of climate variability and risk assessments, but they're like, what does that really do for us? It might help the INGO, but it helps us with nothing. So helping them to really see the causality of what they needed and what they wanted to change really helped their understanding of the whole process. And I said ARCAB is a long-term project, so even though we have indicators at the begin with, over time these want to change, and the theories of change want to change. So first of all, leaving this process with the communities themselves, and then over time they'll be able to change the process themselves as well, and the different outcomes that they want to work towards. Which also just brings in another point about baselines and dynamic baselines and how these need to change with climate change. So as we can review over time different indicators and outcomes, this can then reflect into more flexible and longer term planning, not just focusing on a specific short term project, but looking more longer term and integrating what we're doing in a much better way. Okay, so another element I just want to bring out is looking at that third track, which is really helping INGOs and other agencies decide where are we now to support effective CVA. As we can see, if I just show you here, we have what we call business as usual, and we have what we're calling transformative, and we can move from development to adaptation to climate variability to adaptation to climate change. I think a lot of INGOs that we worked with were like, how do we know that what we're doing is okay, and where does it fit in the larger kind of adaptation picture, and what is the difference between development and adaptation? All these type of questions that we're still trying to work out really. So we devised this with them as a really tool to help them say, this is our long-term goal of transformative adaptation to climate variability. It means, what do we need to do to get there? We might not necessarily just jump here, but it's okay if we're doing development as long as it's transformative development. And it's okay if we're doing DRR as long as it's transformative DRR. So what the plus signs show is that it's a step. They're all steps in the right direction to get where we want to go. So this means really visiting, for example, business as usual development to ensure basic needs are actually being addressed. Empowering those that we work with to ensure that their demands are reflected in decision-making processes through real qualitative approaches. As I said before, moving beyond short-term project-sized approach to those which are more integrated and flexible and long-term. So just to give you an idea of what this means in practice, I've been using this in evaluation, and this is the results of this for actually a participatory natural resource management project with Save the Children in Ethiopia. So once we've devised indicators using our two tracks, as I showed before with the two triangles, it's then using the information we've collected on the ground and interpreting it, and really using them, putting it into this very simple tool to show them where they are on their journey, what they've done, what does that mean, and also looking future, what steps do they need to go to move further towards the long-term goal of transformative adaptation to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll give the word to Bruce to start the discussion. He has a framework and a few pointers that he wants to talk through first. And based on that, we'll open the discussion with the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So as Dennis mentioned, I'm with TANGO International. I'm based in Bangkok. And throughout the last couple of days, the conceptual work that TANGO and as part of the consortium and with other partners have been doing on resilience has been discussed quite a few times. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. There was a session this morning and on Wednesday that covered that in detail. The way we set up this session was to very much look at an existing current framework, which is the ARCAB framework, something that's got quite a bit of traction in the climate adaptation field amongst a wide range of NGOs, and to look at how that holds up within some of the broader learning around resilience, which covers adaptation. Until recently, I was the adaptation advisor for a large INGO, and I recall not so long ago that there was this huge tension between climate change adaptation and resilience, and that there's still a whole lot of people within a whole range of INGOs trying to figure out which covers the other. And I think I'm glad that there's this kind of consensus now. I hope, I'm tasting that in this meeting as well, that resilience actually covers a whole range of shocks and stressors, including climatic. So that hopefully makes moves that forward. If we hold that to be true, then actually taking the resilience, kind of the learning around resilience measurement, and holding it up against the ARCAB framework, hopefully that'll prompt us to have an interesting discussion about whether a framework like the ARCAB framework is useful, and how we can apply it in our own work. Yeah, that ARCAB is just one example. There's a whole range of frameworks. Sorry, what's my space? Pressing space. There's a whole range of frameworks, and again, that proliferation is actually very confusing to everyone. So we're taking ARCAB as one example, and Lucy is gracious enough to set up here with me. So I'm not going to talk about the resilience framework. Basically, there's a conceptual framework which is, and there's different iterations. This is TANGO's way of formulating something that others hold to be true as well. Basically looking at context in which a disturbance occurs, and then an adaptive capacity that offsets vulnerability and thus promotes resilience. That can put you on a pathway either to resilience or on a pathway to of vulnerability, which can be measured by a whole range of development outcomes around food security and nutrition. Our work focuses very much on resilience in the context of food security and nutrition, so that'll come back throughout what I'm talking about. Following what Lucy talked about, what are we measuring and how do we measure it? Very quickly, what we're measuring. And this again, you will have heard this in the last couple of days as well. What we're measuring is, we need to measure the shocks and stresses, we need to measure the outcomes, we need to measure absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. And if I want to break that down really simple, absorptive capacity is the very short-term capacities, kind of things like the coping strategy index, how do you bounce back in the first place? Adaptive capacity are more structural, longer-term decisions that are made. Transformative capacity is very much around structures and systems. Transformative capacity, my question to you would be, what does that mean? I'm still struggling with that, in the same way that I'm struggling with something like gender transformation, which I still don't know what that means. But it's long term. It's 15 years, 20 years down the line. In addition, you need to look at context. So these are the things that we have to measure, we have to keep track of, in a nutshell, if we want to understand resilience. And we need to understand resilience before we actually know what works. So when the title of this session says moving towards transformative resilience, we don't know what that is right now because we're not measuring these different pathways properly. We're not testing these, we haven't formulated the right hypotheses, and we're not testing them properly, not in a robust enough manner. And just as a side note there, we don't have to do everything from scratch. There's a lot of work done in the food security arena and other, and DRR, which we can just borrow from if we're open to it. So sometimes the field tries to reinvent itself, which takes a lot of time and resources and is very frustrating for everyone. So when you try and measure these things, this is the type of analytical framework that you can come up with a whole range of indicators, and this basically tries to cover it all in a comprehensive way. Now, we're not saying you have to measure everything, but this is what you have to draw on once you test your hypotheses. Once you formulate your hypotheses, it needs to travel from left to right. Now, how to measure it? Again, I'm not going to go into the concepts of it, but the Cornell, TANGO, IFPRI, as part of a larger working group, have been working on these, what they're calling right now, 10 measurement and design principles, principles for resilience measurement. There were 15, they've been brought down to 10, and that's an interesting little side note. They found that a lot of the principles actually hold true to be general and are not specific to resilience, which is allowing them to bring it down to more specific, what we hope are resilience principles. Now, I'm sure if we tear this apart in a little breakout session, we'll find out that they all hold true to be, for general sustainable development programming. But maybe that's for a different discussion. These principles are concepts, issues that we need to take into account. Now still, when I look at this, and I've got all the papers here, and I was trying to quickly read up before my little talk, I still don't really know what that means.
If you look at these 10 principles, just to interrupt for a moment, each of these principles can be really in depth. There's much more behind just that one principle. And what I'm wondering what do you focus on? How do you balance these principles? Because if you need to make an M&E framework towards resilience based on these 10 principles, and you want to take all 10 into account, that will be a lot of work. And I'm guessing there will need to be some kind of trade-off when you look at these.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Dennis. I'm going to answer that in my own way. And that's actually the next slide. So there's these 10 principles which have, like you say, a lot of theory behind them, and still need to be unpacked. So how do you then decide what you actually focus on? And so even though I'm part of TANGO, I'm not very close to the TANGO hub that is doing all this conceptual thinking. As I said, I'm based in Bangkok, and I'm doing a lot of these evaluations with larger teams. So my decisions simply are around resources and capacity. And that's the example I'm going to take right now. I'm just going to look at a couple of examples that we've had in the past, recent year, and some upcoming impact evaluations for large NGOs of so-called resilience programming, or you could just call it good food security nutrition programming, and how we've gone about that design. So what does it all mean? What I take away from everything that I just talked about is that we need to understand context. We need to measure shocks and stresses, because in absence of shocks and stresses and the measurement thereof, you can't really measure resilience in its easiest way. I mean, otherwise you'd be looking at adaptive capacity, how that changes over time, and how addressing adaptive deficit improves resilience. It just becomes very complicated. You can't measure all the time, everything all the time, so you need to specify a measurement around the tipping points and thresholds. Tipping points about when certain systems will be pushed over the edge, and thresholds, think of the threshold above which people are resilient and below which they're not. So you need to have that timing right, and that combination of the indicators right as well. Causality and predictability, there was an interesting discussion about that this morning. So this is around the hypotheses. What do we hold to be true? How are things linked together? And how can we use those hypotheses to actually predict? And to me, prediction means designing good programs. Understanding what determinants increase resilience, and what are the types of interventions in specific contexts that you include in your program design. Multi-level units of analysis. Lucy touched on this, so very much working at a lot of different scales. A lot of the IMGO programming around food security still traditionally focus on rural households. We all know that there's a lot more than that, but we still tend to focus on rural households. Expanding that to community level, local governance structures, national systems, and taking a larger systems approach to that. Continuity. So understanding that it's not about static measurement, because they're pathways. So imagine a simple X. You measure at the crossroads, but one pathway is going up, one pathway is going down. So you don't know what the trend is. So it requires a longer term measurement approach, which very much fits with the program approach versus projects. And the understanding of the capacities, the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative. Again, so what does this all mean? So when we're working with partners to do impact evaluations of resilience programming, there's a couple of things that we discuss. And to what depth we address these various issues depends on their resources and their capacities and what they actually want to do with it. But first of all, you need to measure the context. You really have to emphasize situational analyses. And there's a lot of confusion still around situational analyses and baselines. And people take a baseline to be a situational analysis or the other way around. But you really got to separate the two. And based on your situational analyses and throwing in theory of change, build a longer-term theory of change with your range of stakeholders, etc., etc. But that just is an important step just to emphasize. Another point that we make when we work under this resilience framework with our partners is that we don't have to reinvent everything. Again, the INGO that I worked with until recently came up with complete new toolkits, complete new frameworks, try to come up with new indicators, and go talk to an agronomist in Uganda, and he'll tell you exactly that you need to look at seasonal variability, etc., and how to measure that. You don't need to come up with that again. So there's a lot of metrics out there that can really be used. The only field which is relatively new, and you touched on this, Lucy, is the things around aspiration, uncertainty, risk management, innovation, the kind of the psychological elements of dealing with uncertainty, and that's something that needs to be explored further.
I would like to include the audience in this discussion at this point, because we have a good 15 to 18 minutes left here. If you read all these points, what does that all mean to you? Are there any of these points that you recognize, that you can recognize for yourself, that you are applying already? Or those 10 principles that we just touched upon, or the framework that Lucy shortly showed? What of that is recognizable to you working in this field of resilience, M&E?
This list is more recognizable.
This is what it is actually about. Yeah.
The previous one.
Yeah, I don't know what the previous ones mean, actually.
Okay.
I mean,
the principles.
The principles. I mean,
yeah.
you could get lost in that so easily.
As someone fairly new to this, I wanted to turn the question back to you, but with a more kind of operational set of indicators. That is, if we could take it down one more level. I'm trying to design a survey to conduct in some of the Amazon basin regions to look at some of these issues of resilience. And I don't know if anyone has done such a survey or has standard questions that might be coming online in that area. So I thought I would throw that out there. Maybe I can talk to you afterwards if it's too specific. But.
Well, one of the points would be that one of the earlier points was that it's really context specific.
Yes.
And if you're asking me, do you have certain questions you would ask this? So in that sense, very, very context specific, and I would take that into account. It's not that you can easily swap indicators or questions.
But we still, nonetheless, need to find a way to generalize, right? It's a fine line, right?
There is actually take a short and sweet answer to this. Can you turn off the camera? No, I'm kidding. Just I'm actually kidding. Did you turn it up? Okay. I mean, basically, let's first look at what outcomes you're trying to achieve. So if you're looking at food security or nutritional or health-related outcomes, just design your metrics around the causality between your interventions and their contribution to those outcomes within a project or a program.
Yes.
They need to see whether that whole that system that you're supporting is resilient. So you to a range of shocks and stressors. So you would identify the shocks and stressors that could have or likely will have, can't measure everything, impact on that system. And then you measure how people deal with the risk that poses. So something that, it's very short and sweet in terms of a household questionnaire. Make sure you get the disaster and loss of head of household, those kind of things, those kind of modules in there. And have the things around risk management in those questionnaires as well, and in your qualitative tools. And that's a really good start. I mean, we find, and I'm looking to, I've got a colleague here, Lloyd Banworth, who's with TANGO as well, who works with us on a lot of these questionnaires. And simple inclusion of things that already exist, make it easy. Existing metrics, your analytical framework just becomes a bit more complicated. You just need to mix and match a bit more in your tool design.
Okay, thanks. I'll talk to you afterwards if I may. First.
So mixed methods. This has been the story of the. Sorry, you want to continue?
No, I see another question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is just how these evaluations are actually having impact in the community. So how are the findings being used, and how are they being translated in a way that, where are you with that? And then I also just have a question about how to make this process culturally responsive and just diversity, just even looking at this room, just looking at diversity and how that plays into it. So, yeah.
You did it first.
First question is how evaluations are used. That's what we wonder ourselves as well. So we're up on the technical consultants and that addresses slightly your second question. Well, that works with local partners, so we work with local firms to do these types of evaluations. I'm hopeful. We are hopeful around the resilience discourse. We're seeing collaboration now between INGOs. Again, I'm just focusing on the INGO sector right now. That previously didn't really exist. So, for example, there's the resilience working group that includes UN and a large range of INGOs, and they seem to be getting their act together on this. The larger question is, do organizations use evaluations? We were asked by one of our partners just today, can we please do a macro review of how their evaluations are being used because they're not being used? And that's just a larger issue. I think the final point there is, sorry.
No, I also see two different approaches. One approach is organizations who are looking at getting indicators that are very applicable over a full range of countries and that are often called like global indicators. And then you have organizations that are looking at making them as context specific as they can. And up to now, if you look at twin track approaches, top down, bottom up, then you have a swirly circle in between those two, and no one knows what's really in that swirly circle. Because the issue is that I think if you want those very context specific indicators to become global, then there are no context specific indicators anymore, then they become global indicators. And these two don't exclude one another. I think they have a different purpose. One is for project guidance and learning, and the other one is for certain decision making and accountability decisions. And it's fine to have those two.
I think just to quickly touch on that, about the context specific, if you want to, this is kind of a pitfall you don't want to fall into, if you want to make sure an evaluation is used, make it as context specific as possible to that context. And one of my other colleagues was sitting in a gender session and looking at a global program, looking at global indicators, and forget about comparability, but really make sure that for that national context the evaluation holds true, and then actually take it from there. That should be the starting point, usefulness utilization.
Which is actually the starting point under ARCAB. We're actually doing evaluations of all the INGO projects to begin with as a starting point to see what are they doing, where are they now, and then using the results of that to directly inform programming, looking longer term from here forward, which is actually really useful.
I think there's a third component to that too. So we have to, when we raise our hands on, who's involved in what stages in the development process, you have your funders, and they're the ones that are oftentimes paying for these evaluations, and they want, X and Y and Z indicator, but are those the indicators, or is that the information that's useful to you programming teams on the ground? And so there's this balance between, giving a 100-page document to somebody that, 2 people in the world are going to read that's going to gather dust, versus 15 pages that your program staff can really conceptually understand and use in your program.
Right, so the dialectic between compliance and actual learning and evaluative capacity that's building in the organization. Yeah.
I saw a question.
So yeah, so just building on that, Lucy, you talked about the physical, the middle box, the physical evidence that people and institutions are adapting and innovating. Are those very different measures when you look across the INGOs, or is there some commonality there?
Yeah, this box actually is yet to have answers in.
Okay.
This is to support our very long-term view. So this is an example of the theory that we're working towards, but as yet we're still very much focusing on the adaptive capacity and the institutional capacity size to begin with, and to see over a longer term, once we build those two elements, does it actually result in that middle box? So that middle box must be something that's yet kind of unexplored, it's a more longer term goal, but where we would like to get to.
I think we have to accept as well that resilience is something that is fairly new. And the idea moving from adaptive, absorptive, transformative resilience is something that's still fairly new as well. So we don't have any proof yet of that 10-year time frame. And the question is whether or not in the future we will have that proof, because most programs don't really have that time frame of 10 plus years, which is what you would be looking at if you look at transformative resilience. And the questions that pop up is maybe you should measure after actual shocks and stresses on programs that have taken place 10 years ago at some point, because those are the moments that you actually will be able to say anything of that program 10 years ago. Well, it's not that black and white. I see someone shaking his head slightly left and right, and I know where you're coming from. But that is a situation that we haven't measured that in depth yet.
But it can't be really so that you're starting from scratch every time. I suppose, now we're concentrating on methods, but I suppose there is some substance and lessons learned to build upon. So if you talk about the importance of situational analysis, context and so on, what exactly are you talking about? Are we learning what kind of context dimensions are important so we can go further? That's one thing. The other is that I feel that there is kind of perspectiveless things here. Maybe very, very unfair, I suppose. I've just done an interesting evaluation on climate change adaptation from where everything was done, let's say, ideally, from a rights-based perspective, which brings in something very interesting and gives a very, very concrete perspective. Because it's also, so what we're talking about, to some extent about competition about natural resources. So whose perspective are you using to do all these evaluations? Two questions.
Well, probably just the first question. I think you're right. We don't, and I respectfully disagree with my colleagues saying that resilience hasn't been done. There's an awful lot to build off, and we shouldn't be starting from scratch. And that includes the point you're making around what specific context, what are some of the learning around context and situational analyses that we should be taking into account, and that very much relates to, as you indicate, the perspective that you take. You talked about a human rights-based perspective. We have often very sectoral perspectives that need to be integrated, which determine the focus of the situational analysis.
No, there has been clear resilience work in the fields of food security and livelihoods and disaster risk management. What I'm saying is that the longer-term monitoring and evaluation of such resilience programming is still lagging behind. It's not the programming itself. That's certainly helping. And we see on the short term that it works, but on the long term, because of the non-linearity of these processes, we are still not 100% sure, and we haven't seen all that overwhelming evidence that it works. And I don't say that it won't, but I'm saying that it would be nice if we have that long-term perspective as well in the M&E of these programs.
Yeah, we've kind of gotten stuck in, I feel, in the reconceptualizing of resilience. We had a working group recently where we pulled out papers that were 15 years old, and people kind of were, wow, that's so groundbreaking, isn't it? And you just mentioned it. We're conceptually rethinking it, and we're not going about measuring it, which is what we tried to do actually in this session, and we're already getting back into a very conceptual discussion, whereas I would personally, again, I'm just one person in this room, like to talk about that last slide, but how do you actually go about measuring?
Measuring resilience?
Well, just measuring a system's capacity to adapt to shocks and stresses, which is what we're talking about as resilience right now. And how do we do that in a cost-effective way, taking into account things such as more continuous measurement, the time specificity of it, taking into account that there is a data collection overload, so you can't do everything, so you have to go more towards this light touch measurement of specific outcome indicators, and have your larger context analysis, data collection at baseline and endline maybe, and just try and operationalize it. That's what we're interested in. So that's what I'm trying to bring to this discussion right now. But your points are well taken. But again, I think that's very much kind of part of that conceptual discussion around resilience, which I think goes around in circles. Or maybe I'm not getting it.
Can I ask a question of a slightly different nature? I think we all, many of us tend to think of resilience as a positive thing. There are many, many issues and problems that are quite resilient. Poverty traps, corruption, you know, yes, that we're just not really able to crack. I'm looking at Lucy in particular in terms of applying what you're thinking here. I know you'll be well aware of in the context that you're applying of some resilient situations that are extremely negative and harmful. How in the framework that you've clearly been very thoughtful at putting together, are you thinking of identifying those?
Yeah, that definitely comes in the part of the framework that looks at context. And when we're working at community level with developing theories of change and other methods, looking at how those interplay into that understanding of the context to begin with, and then whether indicators or notions of how those will be measured will come into it. Again, it's all very context specific, but those are definitely that will come into the community discussions to plan to begin with, to see the context and complexities that they work in. This
How
is still.
would you pick that up? Can I just push that one more step? Back to your other the other framework with the yeah. Yeah, or maybe the next one. I don't know. Just so I can understand you'd pick it up in the context. You know, one can see where the poverty traps are. One can see where the persistent things that just keep surviving despite what we try and do about them. How do they feature in your indicator framework in a way that, you know, these are almost like leading indicators as opposed to, you know, lagging, which, you know,
Yeah, it's a really good
want to know
question.
what's happening.
Just as a precursor to where we are with ARCAB framework, it's quite new in being implemented, to be honest. So as I said, as far as we've got with where this will be, it will come under in the context bit, but it's just starting to be put into practice. So these issues, I think, the more it is done now, the more we explore it to see whether this is the approach, those issues will come out. But I don't feel I'm able to give you a concrete answer on that today, I'm
I think
afraid.
we're all
Because
struggling with that.
yeah,
And
it's a really
just
good
Francis
point to bring
Wesley
up.
has done some thinking about this, where in fact it's the life cycle of systems, and sometimes what your objective wants to be is to break down that system as opposed to build up a resilient system. You don't want negative systems that are more resilient. So, but I think it's a challenging dimension of this, that because we tend to think of it as a positive objective.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
We can take one more short question, if there is one.
I hope it's short. It's actually quite basic because almost all the work I've done in climate change evaluation is mitigation oriented, and I'm having a hard time conceptually understanding community-based adaptation and resilience measures that are really coming from the community in areas where climate change is still a very distant concept and maybe very, very far from sort of the reality. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of explain a bit about how the validity of these measures from the sort of the end, the climate vulnerable poor perspective, and if they're coming from that, or if they're kind of being given to them and then they sort of absorb it, or is it some give. And I guess, Lucy, I mean, you touched upon this with you're working directly with the communities, that's why I'm...
Yeah, no, we're really lucky to work with quite a few from Bangladesh, and Bangladesh in particular being the fact that it's so vulnerable to climate change. So the communities that we've worked with so far that are seeing a lot of changes, whether that's attributing what you'd call climate change or climate variability, is a bit more unknown. But a lot of so we work through the NGOs that are under the ARCAB platform and trying to capacity build them in this aspect. But a lot of discussions that NGOs will have with the communities they work with is getting them to, or they need to understand that we know the changes that are happening, and then kind of bringing the conversation forward to kind of NGO-led really, what might happen if these continue to get worse in the future, to start to get them to think more long-term. I think that's a lot of the difference of the work that's being done, rather than just focusing on what's happening here and now, what we're going to do, but using the climate change context to look at what we're doing on the ground through development and DLR in a different way. But it is by NGO-led, I would say, at the moment, to help communities to look further into the future.
Thank you. I would like to leave it at that so that people can make it to their next session. I think it's clear that resilience thinking and resilience programming is not something new, it's something that has been developing for a while. But that resilience in itself and the M&E related to it has been transforming over time. And we need to understand it in different time scales. And there will be a trade-off in principles when looking at the monitoring and evaluation, because we just can't do everything from a efficiency point of view. It's also quite context specific, but that doesn't mean that we cannot have both global indicators as well as context specific, very local indicators who both serve a different purpose. And shocks and stresses can be beyond our project and M&E timelines, and we need to take that into account when we are thinking of M&E of resilience. And I would like to close this session.
Thank you.
Thank you.